Hello, everybody. I hope you're all better than I am. Yes, this is, how do you pronounce your surname? Gevers?
Gevers,
Gevers.
or whatever.
Paul or Powell?
I always forget where you ask.
Paul Gevers, is that any good? From the release team will now entertain you. Have fun.
Good morning, everybody. The stuff that I present is rather short. I'll not take the full 50 minutes, so please prepare your questions, because those I find the interesting part of the interaction. At least that's what I mean with the Meet the Team. So who are we? We're a bunch of people delegated by the DPL. A bunch of them are present. Adam, Graham, Jonathan. Ivo is what? They don't want to, so leave them sit. I'm here representing them. And Ivo will show up later, probably. At least I haven't seen him yet. So what do we do? The release team is responsible to oversee the releases that we make as Debian. So we are responsible for what goes into testing, stable and old stable, as long as it's supported. Our official last delegation is on the Devil Announce list. It's indeed already 4 years since the last person joined, so that's why it's 4 years old. By the way, if you're interested to join, you're welcome. We have intended to put things on the wiki last time that we were here. That hasn't happened, obviously, but it's not that we bite. So a tiny bit of the things that we do for stable and old stable. It's mostly managing the point release updates, where obviously in the stable release there's bugs, because there's bugs everywhere. Some of the bugs we find and actually desire to have fixed. That process goes via a point update request, where the change can be prepared. Bug is filed in the BTS to the pseudo package of the release team, and the work then is to review and normally approve the request, and then make sure that later on it flows into the point release. So it's the review work of that and communication about it, and then the actual making the point release happen, which means that a bunch of people need to get together. Some need to get together in real life, or at least don't need to, but typically do, for the testing of the actual point release, but picking a date, make sure that all the relevant teams are available, and then some of the fiddling with release files, signing. GPG apparently is a beast when it comes to point releases, so that needs to be handled. And I'm probably forgetting some of the hard work that Jonathan and Adam typically do behind the scenes, but then it's because I don't know. So everything that's not listed, sorry. I put it here, but with a bit of a space in between, because it's not really under stable and not stable, but we are responsible for picking the code name, which is the most fun job of the team. Doesn't happen so often, unfortunately. So for testing, that's a bit more continuously ongoing work. One thing is we define, or have defined, because it doesn't change on a regular basis, but we define what is allowed to go into testing. And we've codified most of that in our migration software that takes care of migrating stuff from unstable to testing. At this moment, that includes waiting a couple of days for humans to find bugs, QA to come in, so we test with PU parts for installability. Thank you, Nicolas. We run auto-package test on all the reverse dependencies, and I manage that with Antonio. Let me see what's more there. We check that the binaries are built on the buildies. Please don't upload our whole binaries. They If you don't fix that quickly, they get on my radar somehow. And then, am I missing something? Of course, when you want to migrate, you need to make sure that stuff is installable, so we check for that. In the excuses that you see on the web page, we try to figure that out, but actually the real magic of is it installable happens in the second phase, where it's a bit more decryptic to figure out what happened. If you find yourself in the place that the excuses say everything is fine and it's still not migrating and you can't figure it out, please come and talk to us if you need any help figuring the cryptic messages out. The big chunk of the work during the whole development cycle is managing transitions. We have a rather broad idea of transitions. It's not only C library, so name transitions, but our rather broad definition is basically where changes need to happen in multiple other reverse dependencies. So for a so name, that's trivial. Everything that links to the library needs a rebuild. But well, the obvious things are the things like Python, Ruby, Perl. There's a couple of more of those languages that typically need to be managed to not interfere with each other. So that's mostly coordination and the scheduling of the rebuilds when they need to happen. That's done work mostly by Pohu, Sebastian, and Graham. Then, of course, for the last period up to the release, we think of how to actually get to the point that we can release from the state where everybody can just upload to unstable. So that's the freeze period. We think of how can we actually manage that time and period. The current policy is stabilizing the last couple of releases. There's probably some changes coming. We're fleshing that out. I expect questions about that, but we'll get there. The slightly awkward thing that we're responsible for is the architecture qualification. Taking on board new architectures is typically the easier part. Getting rid of architectures at their end of life is a bit nastier. We had a good session on that last Friday. At least from our side, we still need to ask Toolchain, DSA security team on their opinion. But at least we have our idea already. Hopefully we have one new one for this release, but it needs to be confirmed. And during the freeze up to the release, you should all file issues of things that people need to know for the new release. They go into the release notes. We're in the end responsible for the content that goes for. We have the final say, as it's in the delegation, of the content of the release notes. By the way, if there's anybody interested in being editor there, I have done so the last couple of releases. I'm happy to hand over to anybody that likes reviewing text that go into the release notes and managing that with the translations and stability on that. Then a tiny word on Trixie. As I said, the architecture qualification, we have had some discussions. At this moment from our side, absolutely no guarantees, but it sort of looks like what we currently have in testing is what we might release. For sure, other parties can still come to us and say, well, this is the big problem that kicks things out. It's not so burning that we already know of these. We'll warn you when it's happening. And another thing that I'd like to mention, I'm not sure if this will happen before we release, because there are new issues found on proving reproducibility, but particularly Holger and the whole reproducible build teams or people ecosystem, whatever you want to call it, recently started off really rebuilding what we have in the archive. This is a screenshot of a couple of minutes ago. We're currently at about 1/3 having tried to rebuild. They proved that 25% of what we have in the archive is actually reproducible outside of the archive. I think that's a great thing. And now, as a release team, we want to actually start using this. I need to talk to Holger on an interface where I can get the information. You can already see on the current infrastructure where the package is just built twice if you're reproducible or not. But once this is nearing the 100%, we want, and we have an interface, we want to hook this up to the migration software and prevent regressions in testing, just like we do with the other QA checks. So once we have this, we'll hook it up. No regressions of reproducible builds unless you talk to us and get a hint to move things through. So that's hopefully coming soon, and I hope before Trixie. Now, that was what I had to say. The biggest point for me to have this meeting was to allow you also to have questions if there's just things on your mind of how do we work.
I guess I've not been paying enough attention to my email, but are you able to share with us the date for the next point release?
Very good. That's the question I was expecting. We're having some issues that we need to solve first before we're able to pick a date. And I'll not comment further.
But I would like to go on holiday over Christmas, and it would be really nice to know when I have to avoid. Talking about the point release.
Sorry. I think the guy picking the dates is sitting over there.
I know what it is now. I'll tell you in about 10 minutes.
Working? Yeah. At first, I would like to thank you all the team very much, because I think it's extremely important, because distribution without a release is nothing. So you're doing really important stuff. Thanks a lot to everybody. And I have a question which is referring back to my talk, which is where I talked about the freeze depression, where we see, well, we freeze and then nothing's happened. Do you have some opinion about this?
Yes, I do. In the last freezes, I have been trying to make sure that the freeze is as short as possible, because I think, let's say, the most people in the project are sort of indeed cooling down during the freeze, which I think is not good for enthusiasm and energy. But yeah, the freeze is there for a reason, and I believe it's necessary. We have to have a freeze to make sure that we get things in shape. But yes, it's at least my ambition to have a process where we can keep it reasonable short, not longer than we need to have it.
Thank you. By the way, because you said if you have a problem with migration, so I can say from my personal experience, I had some question to you, and you were very patient with questions which were not that hard to answer, and you were always helpful when we had problems with larger things like bioconductor. So I can only recommend to talk to the release team. You usually get a competent and fast answer.
We rather hear from you than that we need to find out things. It's much nicer to answer questions than to say, hey, why did you do this, and then talk to it about it.
I was just, as I said, during the freeze bit, I think there's like, as you said, there's 100 of us who are really engaged and will go and fix all the other stuff. But then there's like 900 people who only do their bit. So they just kind of go, well, I've done my bit, I'll just wait. Or in fact, I haven't even noticed there's a freeze, so I'll just unhelpfully upload things. I'm just wondering, could we think of a mechanism where people who aren't really taking much notice Because in theory, you should be uploading to experimental instead of unstable during this period, right? If you still want to do things. But I just wonder if we could automate this so that people who haven't noticed do the right thing. I mean, I don't know if this is actually a problem in the real world or if mostly this isn't a problem, but it just occurred to me that ideally the system would just go, no, we'll just put the stuff over there for people who haven't been taking notice.
Yeah, so the good thing is that the most disruptive things are the transitions. And we have that process in place during the whole time, so you should not upload your library to unstable without having talked to us. Obviously, if you have one reverse dependency that you manage anyway, then we'd say we don't care. But when it becomes to a couple of packages, then yes, please. And that's not specific for the freeze. If you are the maintainer of Python, Ruby, or whatever, you also know that you shouldn't do that during the freeze. It's a transition again. Yeah, so I think the question was engaging people. So the tracker is becoming more and more aware of where we are in the freeze to also give you a bit more warning there. Obviously, that is when you see that on your tracker pages, it will probably just be too late. So that doesn't really help. Jelmer yesterday had a very interesting remark, very similar to that of having multiple suites. I thought a lot about it last night. I don't have an answer there because there's a couple of problems that you want to prevent, and that doesn't make it trivial to do that. But
I have a partial answer. Wookie, please file a wishlist bug against dgit to say that it should somehow check this and that there should be something you should do to your package to say, yes, I know I'm uploading this during the freeze. And I don't think we have the right data or anything, but if you file the bug, then we can have a conversation with the release team about how a computer could automatically find this information.
There is already a computer parsable
Excellent.
thing, and
Perfect.
the upload is actually also already using that, and it will warn you. If you're using the upload, which I don't know how many, but yeah, it should warn. In some cases, it actually says, are you sure? I think that's more related to the transitions. So if you upload a reverse dependency of a library that's in a transition, it will say, but you're involved in a transition, are you sure that you want to upload? Dput can do the same thing, and dgit can do the same.
I think dgit should do this. In particular, if dgit does this and it's a thing that you represent in your source tree or the way you sign the tag, then tag to upload can do it as well. And then you'll get a snotogram back from tag to upload saying, this is the freeze, don't you know? You should have passed the magic option.
Yeah.
So I have one other thing for the release team, which is, this is going to be like, oh, why am I trolling you like this? But can we please have alphabetical code names? Because I just can't do this. I've never been able to do this, and now with the I'm just like.
Well, the next two are not are new, huh? Yeah, probably you have to convince Pixar to make more Toy Story movies first.
Yes. I have another question. You just mentioned that in some nearish future, a regression of reproducible builds will block your package from migrating. How about other quality assurance metrics like either code coverage or static analysis? If you have enabled that for your project, and Phil just showed how easy it could be to have, for example, code coverage, could that or should that be a criterion for migration?
Well, I love QA. So apart from the blocking versus non-blocking method, we also have the ability to delay. what I liked about the current QA for PO parts is about installability. If your package doesn't install really in the concept of Debian, that really is broken. Auto package test has quite a few false positives or things that are not the problem of the package that wants to migrate, but of the test owning package. And I think at the moment, at least that's what I try to do with me monitoring a lot of these things, is to help the social part from that to make sure that it's bearable for people involved. With code coverage, it feels more like a thing that you should then opt in to for your package release, saying, I don't want to migrate if I drop my own code coverage. If we have somebody setting up a service that does these kind of things, I think the release team would applaud hooking up more QA services that we have. But particularly for this example, I don't think it's a project-wide thing that we want to do, that you cannot regress in code coverage.
So particular in this topic of services that provide testing and similar, we have Salsa, which of course lots of people are using, and more development is moving there, and things like the checks that Phil demonstrated yesterday are running on Salsa. So there seems to be a lot of duplication between a few of the things that auto package test and all the testing migration stuff does, and Salsa checks.
Yes.
Do you see any opportunity for kind of, reusing things?
Sure, but I see what Salsa does, and what we do is quite distinctive, because what Salsa does is pre-upload checks. And what we do is check what is in the archive. And I think those things will always be distinctive. Just like an upstream CI pipeline, I think a lot of upstreams run rightfully linters during their pipeline, while linters in auto package test are bad. I mean, please, if you run them, don't do that. The purpose there is on upstream source. If a linter finds something in Debian, that's not something that you want to fix in Debian. And particularly, it's pretty bad for the maintainers of linters, because if they deliver an improvement, a lot of tests fail. And I've seen that happening, and it's really annoying that your new great better linter is blocked by tests that say you regressed while you improved. Well.
So the really hard thing is architecture qualification, and it gets into controversial decisions and people really wanting their architecture to be included. No parent wants to be told, you've got a really ugly baby there, But there is a problem with small numbers of maintainers for some of the architectures. And there's a problem also with architectures where effectively the hardware is not produced anymore. Is it possible to have a hard criterion which says if the hardware hasn't been produced for 7 years, it gets dropped, or if there are only 2 maintainers for an architecture or a port, we have to drop it?
Those hard criteria exist, but it's extremely hard to have them as hard criteria, because we're all humans. So it's, I don't think there's a problem, at least in my time we haven't added an architecture yet, so I don't know about that. But I consider the problem of dropping an architecture much harder. So the 2 that I've seen going in my time, they were basically driven by the porters saying, well, we think it's time to go. And actually they trivially come very late with that notion. So yeah, it would help for the release team if the people involved in an architecture that is as the Dutch say, I don't know if it's an English expression, walking on their last legs, would maybe earlier try to decide and say, well, we should maybe retire this architecture. And of course it's our responsibility, but it doesn't mean that it's up to us to say, well, now it's too late. It's just, it's much easier to say a formal stamp, yes, we agree, than that we have to make, well, we should kick that one out.
It's always harder when you have to say, yeah, we've got to support that for at least one more release.
Right.
Coming back to the QA metrics and coverage test results, things like that, I think when adding QA gates like that, we need to be aware of the signal to noise ratio, like how many false positives does this produce?
Yep.
And also we need to be aware of the cost benefit ratio of what we're checking for. Like your example of linters being really bad to run during auto package test. If a linter fails for a package you're maintaining downstream, it's a perfectly rational thing to do to say, well, what do you want me to do about it? The risk of regressions for fixing these lint warnings downstream in Debian only is probably higher than the benefit of fixing them. And sure, go upstream and fix these, and they can be in the next release when it's been properly tested. But as a downstream, not only is this kind of not our job, but in some cases we actively shouldn't be doing it.
Not that we had any total disaster about something like that.
And I think Ian is alluding to lint warnings in OpenSSL some years ago, which led to, as he says, disaster.
Yeah, so also particularly because I see so many failed tests, because I happen to not look at passing tests, but mostly at failing tests. Also tests that are flaky, and my personal limit is, let's say, around 1 to 5 to 1 to 8 failures compared to success. I think I can say we consider those RC. And for me, skipping a test that's flaky or just skipping a test as a solution, if the test is bad, just don't run it in the context of auto package test. And don't be afraid to turn it off in the context of an auto package test to solve the problem of, or fix it, of course.
We have this mechanism for marking a particular test case as flaky, so that failures are considered to be, well, maybe this is not actually that bad.
Yes.
And the intended use case for that is that if the test is just not very good upstream, you can run it as part of a flaky test case instead of as part of a reliable test case. And that way, the infrastructure is still telling you, is this still a problem on the architecture you might not own yourself?
If you are looking. And
yes.
Well, with skippable or flaky test, of course, it has only value to add if you intend to look at it. Because adding flaky restriction to a test that nobody looks at is completely useless waste of time of the infrastructure.
Doubly so if it's flagged as flaky and superficial, which means no result of this test actually matters.
I do know that marking stuff as flaky is at the level of the entire auto package test. If that's a big upstream test suite, it might make more sense just exfil the one test that's actually doing that, and then maybe add a second test marked as flaky that runs just that one. If you care about that, I think Pandas has some of them.
Yes. So particularly because auto package test and the way that we use it only care about the final result of all the tests together. If you have a particular test in your test suite that's flaky, it's much better to disable that in the context of a lot and not needing the flaky test than if you mark something flaky at the auto package test level, because that really then you don't get the failure of anything else marked in the end level, because there's no granularity in that. It's a 3-state answer. It's pass, fail, or neutral. And If it's flaky, it only gets pass or neutral, which for migration is the same answer, except for maybe 3 days.
I think one of the big issues with architecture qualification is that Debian has really not succeeded in finding any middle ground between a full release architecture with everything fully supported and left to rot on Debian ports. And this is an issue for ArmyL is the obvious example here. I think there's still companies still making chips with sub-ARM v6 processors. There's definitely still companies making chips with ARM v6 processors. At the same time, the chances that someone's going to want to run a modern high-powered desktop on those, something like GNOME, is becoming increasingly low. And that this has become a fairly major source of tension.
No, similar is with our support of S390X. I think it's great that we have a big endian architecture in our set, but yeah, you can question how much of all the graphical stuff that we do is actually doing there. And within the official archive, I think indeed we have, well, ideas welcome. If you have worked something out, we could become smarter in being able to deal with those kind of splits. I haven't given it an extremely much thought, except for the recent discussion where we were involved with GNOME, where we had to do things to be able to remove it from ArmyL, which wasn't trivial, unfortunately. I've driven an idea on having multiple tiers in the official archive until last year for a couple of years. We've dropped that idea in the official part of the archive, but I still think that it would be great on the port side of things if it wasn't so painful to go from an official architecture to a ports architecture.
Yeah.
And
the biggest problem with ports, from my perspective, is there are no releases.
that's exactly the point that I think that could be improved on that side, yes.
If port architectures had releases, got security updates where they built successfully, if they didn't build successfully, well, too bad, so sad. I'm guessing that most people port is okay for new and upcoming architectures.
I understand that's why it was created.
For architectures in their twilight years, most people, I'm guessing, who still use ArmyL don't really want to be running SID. They want to be running releases.
Yeah, so my offer still stands that if Brittany can help on that side, that I offer the help to change Brittany to support the ports to do releases. Now, Brittany is not the only thing. I mean, it's not there at all yet. So I think they run MiniDeC, which has its complication and doesn't really support doing anything fancy like the multiple suites. So that's a problem I'm not offering help with. But if the ports want something like support with Brittany, I'm still willing to help to figure out how Brittany could support that. But I'm not driving the ports part of that proposal, and the official part I dropped last year.
Fair enough.
So carrying on with ports a little, are we expecting to have an update on the ports for Trixie?
As I mentioned earlier in my talk, I think RISC is doing quite okay. I'm not promising anything. We still need to check with security team, with DSA, if they see issues with RISC. Anybody that sees problems, please let us know. I'm not aware of since libxml migrated, a lot of the problems that were there in testing are gone. So I think it's so far looking good. So I expect risk has a high chance that it can be there. Yeah, the other architecture that's currently in the pipeline, I think the time is maybe running short, except, and also there it's not, except of course as a release team we need to support it and say yes, we believe it can be, but it's currently not in our ballpark. So it's not something we drive or push away either way.
Awesome, thanks. And definitely, I remember I was in the talk in Kosovo when you were talking about the different tiers of architectures. I mean, you know, I can see a day coming very soon when we're going to be talking about just dropping i386 as well. I mean, various bits and pieces of its ecosystem are tailing off. We're not going to have an i386 kernel, for example.
It's not there already.
Sorry?
It's dropped already.
Yeah, exactly. You know, we've already, we're not doing DI builds for it, you know, and there are similar issues going to be around other architectures. So even, I think we're heading towards the different tiers of architecture support already, but without any formal definitions. And that's where I agree with you. We need to have a better conversation and actually, you know, do some of this properly.
Well, and already the architectures, not all architectures are equal. Some are more equal than others.
Exactly.
As an example of our migration testing, we do test that an whole package installs on AMD 64 and ARM 64. But you're allowed to regress on the other architectures. And that's just a practical thing that if we do not do that, it just becomes a lot of hand-holding every time to judge that. And well, in our release policy, we have the same thing about failing out-of-package test. And a failing out-of-package test is RC already on AMD 64 and ARM 64. We have not been enforcing that, but that's our statement, but only on those two architectures. So yeah, there's a couple of things that are already different between the different architectures, just for practical purposes.
Coming back to GNOME not being useful on ARMEL, you'll be pleased to hear that we're just waiting on the FTP team to remove old binaries, after which GNOME will not be on ARMEL, because it picked up a dependency on a new version of Mozilla's JavaScript library, which requires atomic operations for relatively basic functionality, and fails its tests on ARMEL. And that was just the final straw that made us think this is not worth sinking effort into anymore. So ARMEL is already becoming a little bit of a partial architecture. The big problem with partial architectures is when you have something that breaks further down the stack. We can remove the top level of GNOME quite easily because nothing much depends on that. But if you have an architecture that can't build something like GTK, let's say, suddenly you've got to go around all the other libraries that happen to have a GUI front end in the same source package as a non-GUI thing. And say, instead of having we build the GTK GUI front end, you have to build the front end only on those architectures that still have GTK. And that's a lot of action at a distance that nobody really wants to do. We used to do that for S390, I believe. It would not compile anything that needed graphics, and that was a massive pain. So there's a reason we stopped.
On the subject of i386, given that we've dropped the i386 kernel, do we want to seriously consider bumping the baseline of the i386 port? Because at least from my point of view as a Rust team member, the biggest pain point with i386 is the fact that it's built with SSE2 disabled. And that causes a lot of test failures for us. If you build with SSE2 enabled, you get the same test results on AMD 64 in floating point cases. If you build without SSE2, you get subtly different results from every other architecture. And
we stated last year already that we consider that a matter of the port. So we're not against it, but we're not pushing either.
That brings to another problem with i386. The people who still cared about i386 asked the list masters for a port mailing list, and it just never got actioned by them. And we've got this situation where there really is no, the ARM ports are the people who hang out on Debian ARM, sort of. The PowerPC ports are the people who hang out under PowerPC and Debian PowerPC and so on. But who are the i386 porters? Where are they? And the answer seems to be nowhere at the moment.
That typically is an answer for any porter. We do a porter call, but that doesn't mean that you know who the porters are.
So the unique problem with i386, which I think none of our other ports have, is that it's not really one port, it's really two ports in a trench code. There is the faction of people who are interested in i386 because they literally have an old Pentium or whatever that they want to run their stuff on, and we could call that i386 for retro computing, maybe. You have the old hardware, you want to keep running it and not turn it into e-waste. And there is also the segment of i386 interested people, like me with my Steam runtime hat on, who want to be able to run legacy 32-bit binaries. And they have very different needs. The people with old computers want a low baseline. They want 64-bit time T so they can keep using their 90s computers into the 2040s. They don't particularly care about compatibility with proprietary binaries because, hey, free software project. They can recompile everything they care about. And they want a full port with a kernel and everything. The people who want proprietary binaries to still work, we only need the bottom of the stack. We need Mesa and all points below it, basically. And that's about it. So the current state of i386 with the kernel and the installer falling off is perfectly fine for that use case, but we would like a higher baseline. And reconciling those two is kind of difficult.
I think we already made the decision last year that the i386 doesn't support the retro group anymore,
right.
And that's fine from Debian.
And in the time T mega thread, I think we had something approaching consensus that for the retro computing use case, the thing to do would be propose a new parallel port that has a 64-bit time T and is future-proof and is for free software and can have as low a baseline as its porters want it to. But that's not i386 because existing software outside our control knows that i386 is the backwards compatible architecture.
Any last questions?
Can we fix it so that when I upload a new package, I can just upload a source package, that I don't have to upload a binary package and then straight away, once it's accepted, upload a source package to get it into testing?
That's not in my control. The FTP masters have a patch to duck, to configure duck to not do that, to throw away the binaries if you upload them. The problem there is that there's a couple of corner cases where that causes problems. And actually what needs to be done there is that these corner cases need to be documented and written out what needs to happen in those corner cases, and then they can enable this configuration. But before that happens, they don't want to turn it on, and that documentation doesn't appear out of thin air. That's how I understand the problem, so that's about you uploading binaries, of course.
Thank you.
When you upload in practice, it's only a problem for architecture all binaries, because Sebastian is already running scripts to see uploads that happen on non-architecture all binaries, and he just bin and amuse them. So if by accident you happen to upload a binary, that typically is fixed unless an arch all binary is involved.
possibly part of a later, more detailed discussion. But back to the question about incoming ports and outgoing, incoming architectures and outgoing architectures. Do we already think we know the answer to? There's the concept of if someone's enthused enough, we could do releases, which we could do. It's just work. But should we in fact split into ports in and ports out, ports new and ports old? I don't know what I want to call it. Do we? Because then we wouldn't have to do releases for the things we don't, on the way up. That's kind of pointless. So you reduce the subset of work, but maybe that doesn't really help.
I think if you do...
Is there enough difference, basically, between these two flavors?
If you would use Brittany on the side of the ports as well to do the migration and the handling of the suite, or at least the testing suite, because stable is, of course, much more stable. Like what we did in the beginning of RISC, it was already in the FTP master domain, so in the official archives, and Brittany just completely ignored them. And so there was no testing. It doesn't really matter. So it doesn't really, I don't think it matters if it's one infrastructure or two.
But all we have to do is mark a flag, and that's it. So there's not much point in separating the actual stuff. Fair enough. Yeah, fine. Good.
Well, I think we're in the last 5 minutes, so if there's a quick question or two, or maybe we're done.
And thank you for all the questions.